So today I'm going to be talking about group perspectives. So when we talk about intergroup dynamics or basically anything having to do with the social world, we're likely to come across these types of phrases. Ones that reference some notion of a group perspective, like the Black perspective on cultural appropriation or the American perspective on international affairs. Similarly, we might use locutions like as a feminist or as a trans person to preface certain statements about the way that one represents the world not only as an individual, but as a member of a social group. So something's going on here. I think that there's a very powerful intuition that there is some possibility of sharing a perspective in virtue of group membership that these ordinary language phrases point towards. And we can find a similar presupposition in academic discourse as well, particularly in issues like standpoint theory or double consciousness, or even transformative experiences. So questions like, do group members have privileged access to their associated group perspectives? And are there systematic failings to grasp the perspectives of groups we're not part of? Rely on a notion of some intuitive notion of a group perspective. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, there hasn't really been a systemic attempt in the literature to delineate what group perspectives are in their own right. So my task in this paper is to provide an account of group perspectives that can be put to work to solve these other problems. The challenge here really lies in the component parts of what group perspectives are. You see, perspectives and groups are both elusive and challenging concepts to define in their own right, and their connection is not super clear. So I hope to make way today towards a robust notion of a group perspective that agrees with our intuitive use of the term, but can make sense of what is particularly perspectival about it. So first, I'm going to give a very bare bones account of what I take perspectives in general to be, and then I'm going to assess different notions of groups that have been used to explain other mental phenomena relating to groups, namely group beliefs, to see if they can provide a good template to understand group perspectives. Spoiler alert, I don't think they do because they're tailored for propositional analyses, but I think perspectives are largely a non-propositional phenomenon. So I'm going to introduce a new conception of groups that can be used towards understanding what group perspectives are. And then I'm going to show further connections in the empirical literature that supports my view and suggest some upshots. Okay, so the first thing we have to get through is a simple analysis of what perspectives are. Now, perspectives are notoriously difficult to define. They're used in very diverse contexts in many different ways, and it's easy to doubt that any particular notion of a perspective can really unify these different extensions of the term. However, I think there are at least three functions of perspectives that we can identify that seem to be present in some form or other in these disparate uses. So what I'm going to do now is identify these functions and show minimally how it can apply to various different kinds of perspectives to give a taste of how this notion can plausibly be used as a foundation for conceptualizing group perspectives, because a group perspective is ultimately a kind of perspective. So on my account, perspectives play an ancillary role in our representations by directing attention and eliciting certain responses through encoding indexical relations. These functions are probably the most obvious in the visuospatial case. So think about how we're oriented from a particular spatio-temporal location at a given time. Perspectives orient us towards other objects through an indexical anchor. Now, in ordinary visuospatial perception, our bodies usually serve as an indexical anchor, but it does not need to be our own bodies. Gareth Evans has an example where somebody is sitting in a surface vessel and becomes totally absorbed in a submarine's video stream and can maneuver the submarine at will. He talks about how there's a sense in which the submarine becomes the subject's body as an indexical anchor insofar as it provides a reliable connection of inputs of perceptual content that the subject responds to. So he might think, I'm here regarding the submarine's location, and the vessel is there where his body is. So going back to the account of perspective, we can see how our visuospatial perspectives take inputs from an indexical anchor to structure our representations in both what we attend to and prompts responses. One way it does this is obviously in restricting the perceptual field, so we can't see everything there is to see at the same time, and it limits what we can attend to. Often, this can structure attention so what's bigger in the field is what we attend to, and sometimes respond to it if it becomes a threat. So, let's say there's a shark coming nearby, I'll probably move, right? So, that's the basic idea in the visual spatial case. So, where we have a more abstract notion of perspective, I think these functions can still be present. So, obviously, attention and response are present in various analyses of abstract perspectives. I'm thinking in particular of Liz Camp's, where she talks about patterns of attention and how they can contribute to action production. So, for example, if I have a perspective of hunger, I might parse the space of possibilities differently than I would if I weren't. I might attend to, the faintest aroma of food, and maybe if I'm famished, I'll even eat insects because I'll see them as food, which is an interpretation I wouldn't have had otherwise. Now, where the indexical anchor comes in for these kinds of more abstract perspectives is a little different. So, obviously, this isn't as attributable to a region in physical space as spatial perspectives are, but I think we can index these different kinds of interpretive modes to something like an agential mode that T. Nguyen talks about in the context of games, but we can expand to capture various other generic modes that allow us to form certain patterns of attention and response. For example, being a hungry agent or taking on the perspective of a particular fictional character can fit in here. So where perspectives are indexed to individuals is where we can get a first personal perspective, which might not, and I suspect is not, equivalent to being indexed to an individual's body. But any particularities of that particular first personal perspective are not of concern right now. So, to recap in a nutshell, this functional notion of perspective identifies underlying commonalities that undergird various extensions of the term perspective, and these include directing attention, eliciting certain responses, importantly, encoding these through an indexical relation. Suppose you just accept that account of perspective that I've offered. Now we have to figure out what it means for a group perspective to exist. Now, to clarify, I don't want to posit that groups themselves form a singular representation that's independent of its constituent members. That to me seems immediately ontologically troublesome. I think it makes more sense to talk about how an individual can instantiate a group perspective, and it's more consistent with how we talk about the concept. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's go through some popular ways to model group states. So in the social epistemology literature, there are broadly two sorts of accounts that capture different intuitions about what groups are. I'll go through them very quickly in this presentation to get to my positive proposal, but I'd be happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. So on one hand, we have the aggregative approach, which treats groups like mere collections of individuals. And on the other, we have the integrative approach, which treats groups as agents distinct from their members. So an aggregative approach to groups would look something like this. It would first deny that a group perspective is anything over and above the constituent members' perspectives. It would determine a group perspective through an aggregative profile of individual perspectives, perhaps taking into account a proportion of certain features that are found in the aggregate. So if we were to look at the doctor perspective, for example, we could see that many individual doctors tend to attend to certain features of, say, x-rays that's distinct from how non-doctors would. So if their perspectives encode a certain amount of salience to a certain shape that leads to a certain diagnosis, then we can say, okay, there are enough individuals who do this in a collection of people that we happen to call doctors. So let's say it's part of the group perspective of doctors. So aggregative approaches have the advantage of being tractable and able to accommodate a large variety of groupings of individuals. However, they are limited in explaining emergent group phenomena, such as what can happen in cases where individuals collectively come to form new ways of interpreting their experiences that were not antecedently present in their individual perspectives. So I have in mind cases like consciousness raising. There's a famous case in the epistemic injustice literature that illustrates this nicely, of the moment when women in the workplace coined the term sexual harassment. Basically, what came out of this experience is that women who were present at this meeting had all experienced sexual harassment as individuals. When they shared their stories, they realized that this was actually not something that they were misinterpreting or overreacting to, that there was a systemic phenomenon occurring that changed the way they saw behavior from men, from perhaps innocuous forms of flirting that they felt they were maybe overreacting to in their discomfort to something that was, seriously harmful to women in general. And now I think there's definitely a case for a perspectival shift that occurred, as well as a stabilization of the group women in the workplace, that an aggregative approach is ill-suited to explain. But this is obviously something that an integrative approach can accommodate, insofar as they are specifically tailored to account for this kind of emergent collective phenomena. So integrative approaches spotlight a group's organizational structure in distinguishing mere collections of individuals to group agents that pursue certain aims over various scenarios. So with the women in the workplace example, they collectively organized to bring awareness of sexual harassment about. They aimed to change workplace policies, etc. But while integrative approaches seem more promising than aggregative ones, they seem to swing in the other direction and actually require too much organization or agency to really account for a variety of groups to which we attribute perspectives. So, for example, if we talk about the perspectives of racial groups, which is common, we often hear about the white perspective or the Black perspective on various issues and current affairs, but they don't really meet the requirements for being a group agent. Just because we have a collection of white people doesn't mean that they're organized along some formal ethos or committed to specific goals, but there seems to be something to the phenomenon here that's not captured by the notion of group agency. And of course, we can say, okay, but for those groups, we don't really mean that there's a perspective. We're just speaking figuratively. But I don't think that's good enough. I think we have to change the way that we're conceptualizing what groups are to account for some robust perspectival phenomenon that's occurring here. Now, I want to clarify again that my goal here is not to jettison our existing approaches of groups. I very much believe that there's room to be a pluralist here in allowing for different approaches of groups to serve different aims. So what I'm about to propose is specifically geared towards an analysis of group perspectives. And I think this is compatible with saying that the aggregative or the integrative approaches to groups is much more suitable for explaining other phenomena like group beliefs or justification. So my proposal is to model groups on a spatial model and suggest that group perspectives work similarly to spatial ones insofar as the kind of indexical relation encoded by an indexical anchor in a social space is similar to the kind that's encoded in physical spaces. Now, this might seem like a weird approach, but there is precedent for this kind of claim. I'm thinking about how the term social location is often used interchangeably with groups. Now, many theorists who invoke social locations don't really have as robust a notion in mind as what I'm proposing here, but I think there are reasons to take this seriously. What I'm proposing is that groups occupy social locations in social space, analogously to how bodies occupy physical locations in physical space. So social locations, like physical ones, delineate regions in space that stand in relations with other regions. No particular occupant of a given social location is essential to its existence. So social locations can persist through changes in membership, much like physical ones. My claim is that much like how the spatial indexical here expresses an indexical thought anchored through a particular region in physical space, the first person plural indexicals we and us can express indexical thoughts that are anchored in social space. So to illustrate, we can compare the following kinds of sentences. The first, said by a person with paraplegia, is, we need ramps to enter some buildings because we can't climb stairs. And the second is, people with paraplegia need ramps to enter some buildings because people with paraplegia can't climb stairs. So 1 and 2 seem to express the same propositional content, given that one is uttered by a person with paraplegia, but only one requires the particular relation between the speaker and the content expressed to hold. So if a speaker were not oriented in the right way towards these contents, they do not possess the relevant indexical mode of thought that we express this because they don't have the right relation to the content. By contrast, 2 assumes no such relation and it doesn't require particular features of the utterer to hold. So in 1, it's important to note that the person with paraplegia who utters the sentence is not simply referring to herself as an individual, but the group of people with paraplegia who share common reality in orienting themselves to their environments, especially in cases where their paraplegia becomes more significant. Here we have cases where they're faced with inadequate accommodations. And we can see how their attention and responses can be directed as a result of being part of this group. So they might systematically attend to missing ramps in buildings insofar as it limits their courses of action, whereas able-bodied people might systematically fail to notice this absence in the first place because they can enter the building by climbing stairs and are not limited by this lack of accommodation. In addition to this, I argue that indexical anchors in social space provide comparable relations to those found in physical space. So, like how being located in physical space automatically encodes both the here and there thoughts, a crucial aspect of being oriented in social space is making distinctions between one's in group, the we, and out groups, the they. Some immediate advantages of this view over, say, an aggregative approach is how we can explain collective predication that semanticists generally agree do not reduce to individual predication. So, for example, if someone says, we are the champions, there's really something different going on here than collecting a bunch of individuals who are thinking, I am the champion, and attributing it to the collection of people who think that. The spatial model would say that multiple subjects stand in the region that designates we, the champions, apart from a different region that designates them, the losers, where multiple subjects can stand in each of these relations or in each of these regions, but the relations that hold between these regions do not rely on any particular individuals or even the collection of individuals' instantiations of the relation. Also, it avoids requiring group agency, as we saw with the downfall of the integrative approach, by conceding that groups like people with paraplegia don't necessarily meet the standards for group agency insofar as they lack a robust organizational structure. But a person with paraplegia can still form the relevant indexical thoughts associated with the group by standing in certain relations with others. So in this paper, I argue that in addition, the spatial models of groups that I propose can contextualize two phenomena at the group level in a way that's consonant with empirical data on both visuospatial perspectives and studies on group dynamics. The first is that having a perspective does not entail conscious awareness of having one, and the second is the ability to recognize having a perspective is crucial to cognitive development. Essentially, I think there are ways to explain these phenomena at the group level if we take into account the ways in which being situated in a social space can orient one's thoughts without conscious awareness of this. So potentially we can use this to explain phenomena like white privilege through this framework. And second, I think that we can track similar development in cases where group identity is made salient to group members and how that can give us a better understanding of the developments behind group stabilization as well. In addition, the framework that I propose through the spatial model of groups provides a novel theoretical framework for situating surprising empirical findings that posit very strong connections between social and spatial cognition. For example, it could potentially offer grounds for the fact that similar neural mechanisms underlie the way we form representations in these realms by highlighting how both physical and social locations are ultimately relational in nature and how perspectives parse different spaces to direct attention and response. It can also offer tools to help analyze phenomena like perspective taking. In particular, we have to notice that the framework that I provide about perspectives, insofar as they're thin and only require some relative or reliable connection between inputs and outputs, opens the possibility for perspective taking, which could potentially be important for things like understanding empathy or intergroup understanding. But it also leaves open the possibility to specify what establishing a reliable connection entails. So it could also potentially explain possible limitations for achieving complete understanding of another group's perspective. And finally, this model can also set the groundwork for further conceptual analyses of social phenomena, such as intersectionality, and investigating further how certain dimensions in social space interact. And I think this model can also explain a variety of different relations that can hold between groups of varying social significance. But more importantly, I think it can shed light on intergroup issues that involve oppressive hierarchical relations. So one thing I like about this theory is how it is general enough to give us the shape of intergroup dynamics at an abstract level, but it can be used to explain phenomena of greater social importance as well. I skipped through a lot of details to get through the main points of this paper, but I'm really excited to have a discussion with you. So thank you very much for listening.